Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a fantastic week. Saying hi from New York. And it's really a privilege and a pleasure this week that we're going to be joined by my friend Kevin Ryan, who I've known probably for like 20, 25 years. We're the old school Silicon Alley guys who were here in the 90s and basically stayed ever since. And, for the fun fact or the little story, Kevin is actually the one who convinced me to go to Antarctica. So I'm sure we will be talking about that at some point today. So, without any further ado, let's get going. Welcome to episode 42, Kevin Ryan, the Unicorn Builder. So, Kevin, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So, why don't we start with, the very basics? Like, how did you get into tech to begin with?
Yeah, so in my 20s, I was having a more traditional corporate life. I worked in investment banking for 4 years in New York and in London. I went to INSEAD, to business school in France. Then I was working for Disney for a couple of years, based in Paris for the launch of Euro Disney. And I came back then to be the CFO and COO of a division of a media company in the United States. This is now 94, 95. And as part of that, I launched an internet site for them, which became very successful. And so in beginning 96, I started thinking this would be the most fundamental, development I might see in my lifetime. And it was still very, very early. And so I went to the parent company and said, look, should we, why don't you give me millions of dollars and I'll build up an internet division? And they said no. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to go do this on my own. I was going to start an internet company, and I ran across the two guys who had started DoubleClick 6 months before. And they convinced me to join them, and then became the president for 4 years and the CEO for 5 years of DoubleClick, which was an extraordinary experience for me.
Can you talk to us a little bit of the ups and downs of like that experience? Because I think most people here are not aware of like how crazy the bubble was on the highs, the lows, etc.
Yeah, in the beginning, 96, we forget that most people didn't necessarily believe in the internet, didn't know about it. There were probably 50 people working in New York City really involved in the internet in 96. And so 4 years later, we had 2,000 employees in 25 countries. So I spent my early 30s doing that. We went public 24 months after we started, which, like all things that are that fun, are now completely illegal. But there was less regulation. It was just a crazy period. Internet was on the cover of every magazine. It was a fantastic time. And we moved so quickly to do all that. We made 10 acquisitions during that time, made bad decisions along the way too. So that was the first 4 years. And then the next 5 years, during the 2001, 2002 period, we had 70% of our clients go bankrupt. So for those of you taking notes, that's really not a good idea. And not only did we lose their business, but they generally owed us $100,000 or $200,000, which they of course didn't pay. So very ugly. Did 7 rounds of layoffs. Everyone always tells you should do 1 round of layoff and be done with it, but we had no idea when it was going to end. And so we thought we did a big round and then another one, and everyone gets depressed. The stock price went from $130 a share to $5 a share. So all of your shareholders hate you, even though the same happened to Amazon and Yahoo and everyone else, but they don't care. So it's a very tough time. And the only silver lining there was that it wiped out all of our competitors. So strategically in 98, 99, I had 35 competitors. Pricing was brutal, very tough to make money, and most of them got wiped out. And so we ended up as being the biggest, most dominant player in ad technology. And that's still true today, actually. It's part of Google, but DoubleClick is the dominant player in the world in ad technology.
Were there any moments where you thought you're not going to make it, or you always had like the balance sheet to be okay given the rounds of layoffs?
So one thing that was either lucky or skillful is in 2000, I went out and raised an enormous secondary, a preposterous secondary at the time of $800 million. And we didn't have any use for it, but we were priced at $12 billion, so I thought, why not? And so we knew we were never going to go out of business. That also became very helpful because when you looked at the competitors who had 20 million in the bank, you thought, they might go out of business. It's a little bit like what's been happening in banking. You look at the weaker players right now and you're nervous to do business with them because you have no idea. And so it helped our business. We knew we were going out of business. The other thing that was fundamental to me is that if you forgot the stock price, the one thing I could see literally every month was that volume was increasing. So business was going up, the internet was not going away, page volume was growing. We were basically a proxy. And so I sat there and I thought, if this keeps growing forever, and I really thought it would, and it basically has, then eventually the largest player is going to be successful. It's very rare you're in an industry where the person doing the most volume, like the steel plant with the most volume, unless they're idiots, they figure out a way to make money.
That's a good point. So at what point did you become CEO? So you were there were already two founders when you came in. What was your first role, and how did that transition happen?
Yeah, so when we had 10 people, we couldn't really have a CEO and a president. So I actually started for several months as CFO and then moved into president. And we had everyone report to me so that we could have the CEO, who's still a very close friend, Kevin O'Connor, focus mostly on product and external things, but really not managing very many people. So even when I was president, it was a very, very strong president position. I had 2,000 people reporting to me. Then when things started to go down, Kevin decided that he really wanted to step down. And so he moved to Santa Barbara, became the chairman, and I took over as CEO in must have been 2000 sometime.
Okay. And when was it acquired by Google, and how was that transition story?
There were two acquisitions. One, the company went private in 2005. And so Hellman and Friedman paid a 50% premium to the stock price. So we really, in a way, didn't have a choice there. We had to sell the company. Kevin and I and Dwight really weren't sure we wanted to sell the company, but the rest of the board did. Not an irrational decision, but it turns out that the internet was growing, things were good, things were coming back. So anyway, we sold it for $1 billion, and then Google bought it for $3 billion about 2.5 years later.
Okay, private equity.
I didn't stay. Dwight and I did not stay during that time.
I see.
So we went off to start other companies.
So what happened after you left DoubleClick?
So then my number two, David Rosenblatt, who's the CEO of First Dibs and a fantastic executive, took over. And really the internet just kept coming back. Volumes were increasing, things were better. And so everyone in the sector did well. DoubleClick didn't necessarily do better than other people, but it continued to do extremely well, big market share, and all its competitors did well at the same time. So all of a sudden,
it's 2005. You've had your first real successful exit. The internet is definitely going up to the right. The world is your oyster. You have all the options available to you. So how did you decide what to do?
Yeah, it was at that time, it was the most successful exit ever in the history of internet startups in New York. So, it was a good time. And I remember thinking I had three options. I was either going to run another company because I had been managing a lot of people and I was one of the few people who had done that. I didn't see any other company that I was particularly excited about. If you look back in 2005, there weren't that many promising companies in New York City. Secondly, I could have been investing. I didn't want to do that yet. I still felt like I kind of wanted to operate and build. And so third was starting, my own company or own companies. And so Dwight and I decided to do something unusual, which you're told you can't do, which is start multiple companies at the same time.
And what was the thinking? Was the thinking most of these things fail, this way we could figure out which ones work? Or actually, I like all these ideas, they might all work, and we'll figure out how to get executives for, or something else?
Yeah, it was mostly that I thought that you could actually scale what I did, and to a certain extent what Dwight did. We thought we were very valuable. In the beginning of a company, when you think about it, Fabrice, if you and I started a company tomorrow, in the first year, especially if you're building a technology product, there's actually not that much to do if you're not coding. And so there's actually extra time. So we came up with one idea and then thought, from my point of view, I wasn't even being used full time. So then we came up with another idea, started that, then thought we could do another one and find a CEO, add a lot of value. I was chairman of all these companies. Dwight was either the CTO or, a board advisor on technology. So we felt it was a really good combination of skills that we could bring to the table. And so we started that process. And in a way, Dwight retired many years ago, but I'm still doing the same thing. I've just scaled it since then. And it turns out you can start multiple companies and it can work.
Did you ever get tempted to go back in the CEO role and like have thousands of people and run the day-to-day operations? Because sometimes, it feels like that's where the glory is.
Yep.
And sometimes, if you're an intellectual dilettante, like probably the two of us are, having diversity, is interesting too. But like there's a tension there.
Yep. And so I've always been open to that idea. And so actually, after I started Gilt in 2008, in our second year, we did 175 million in revenue, which is quite extraordinary. I'm not sure anyone in New York has done that. And so as you can imagine, that's good in many ways. It also put enormous strain on the company. And so internally, what people couldn't see is that the operations were not going well. There's a moment where it took us 2 weeks to get back to someone if they called customer support, which is obviously not ideal. We had warehouses. And so I actually felt like I was the right person to step in and be CEO. So I did do that. And it was, by the way, it was also a very fun business. It was doing incredibly well. And so I thought, this is going to be fun. I'll do that. So I did do that for 3 years, got the operations in a pretty good place, felt good about it, and then hired a CEO to come in, Michelle Peluso, who was fantastic. And then the next week I started Zola, which was another company.
And because you felt the need to, because you already were working on it, or
at that point, I felt like the rate of change in that company had slowed down a lot. I didn't feel as good about the next couple of years. I thought, let's have someone else come in here and do that. Maybe a fresh approach will be great. I have other things I want to do as well. So I think of myself even today, not really as an investor, but as an operator. And my day-to-day as chairman of 15 companies really is extremely operational. I'm really just working with the CEOs all the time, or running AlleyCorp, which is also operational. So I really love doing that. I also stepped in briefly at Mongo. We made a transition for CEOs about 7 years ago. And so during that 3 months, I was the de facto CEO while I was finding a new CEO there. So I step in if I need to once in a while, but right now I can't. I have too many other things going on.
Is AlleyCorp the result of like this tinkering of like, let's launch these different things and let's now create a structure around it? Or was that the intent from the get-go? Or like, is it an ex post rationalization? Or
No, it definitely evolved over time. I didn't have that original vision. It was just more really starting one company, then another. And then I realized, you know what, there's some areas like healthcare that I just don't think I have the right background. There are some things I'd get a business plan and realize, you know what, I don't really understand this because it's just too medical or too technical. And so then I thought, I should bring someone on board who can bring that expertise on. And then I've just expanded from there. And so now we have multiple areas, but I like having vertical expertise. And it's one of the things I've always admired about what you've done, which is, you do a lot of different things, but there's a lot of marketplace focus. You know what you're doing. Your team knows what you're doing. You have a reputation out there. Everyone shows you those. And that makes you a better investor. And so I want to do the same thing in other verticals.
So maybe for the people that are not completely familiar with the background, let's talk through a few of the companies that you built and then how it led to AlleyCorp and what is AlleyCorp today?
Yeah, so a pivotal year was 2008 then, because during that year I started Business Insider, which was just an idea I had and I wanted to go do that. I interviewed multiple people to be CEO, found Henry Blodgett, brought him on board as co-founder and CEO. He's done an incredible job. By the way, he's still there 15 years later. I was chairman of that company for 9 years, and we sold that in 2015 for about $500 million. And Gilt, same thing. I started the same year, ended up doing $500 million in revenue. We then sold that to Saks in about the same time. And then also started MongoDB, publicly traded database company. It's worth about $14 billion. It went public about 5 years ago. And I stayed as chairman up until about 2.5 years ago of the company. Then I started Zola, which is a wedding registry company. Some of you may know. Then I started Nomad Health the year later, which does $500 million in revenue, uses technology to place temporary nurses. And then since then, I've accelerated, and now I start a lot more companies and also invest in companies.
Any lessons learned along the way in doing all these things? Because it also feels, and I don't know how you came up with these ideas, because, we're talking like a database company, a wedding registry, a staffing company for nurses and doctors. They're wildly different. How did you come up with these ideas as well?
So each one has a slightly different story. In Gilt, I just saw a French company that you and I knew about called Vente Privée that was doing $1 billion in revenue in 2008 in France. And yet no one was doing that business model in the United States. So it was no more genius than just saying, wow, someone should do that here. Very few people thought about taking a French idea and bringing it here. They thought the American ideas went there, but it was a good idea. And so we did that. Business Insider and Zola were just two products that I wanted, thought should exist, and didn't exist at the time. You know, when you registered at Bloomingdale's in 2014, you could only buy glasses, forks, knives, furniture. Yet, you know, if I were getting a wedding present for you, Fabrice, none of those things would be what I think you would want. I'd want to get you, you know, something related to heliskiing or, you know, a whole bunch of different things. You know, tickets to Burning Man, I don't know, all kinds of things that aren't going to be on the Bloomingdale's list. And so I created a site where you could do that, and that made a lot of sense. And, you know, people forget today the Business Insider, at the time, the Wall Street Journal and Business Week did not update their websites during the day. They were still on the schedule of, no, we publish in the morning, and then we publish again the next morning. And I was like, that makes no sense. So those are simple ideas that I had. And, you know, by the way, many good ideas are incredibly simple.
Yeah.
You have to hit the right timing. Nomad was an idea that I actually was pitched by someone who had the idea but couldn't do it themselves. And so I said, look, I don't take other people's ideas, but why don't I do this idea? I'll put the money in, I'll be the chairman, I'll build it, and you be on the board and have equity in the company. And so we did that, and that's been very successful. And then Mongo, you know, we knew that the Oracle database was something that was not scaling as well as we liked, was extremely expensive for us, and just didn't feel like it was the database of the future. But I couldn't have done that without Dwight and my other co-founder, Elliot Horowitz, who are brilliant technically and could build that product.
And that makes a lot of sense. So when did the formal structure for AlleyCorp itself begin? Like, when was that, followed? When did the pieces start falling into place?
People, it was really started by 2015, 16, where I started adding people and building up because I just thought it could scale more. I was becoming on more boards. I could see there would be a limit to that. And so I thought there's more opportunities to do things. I was also getting liquidity from some of the other early deals. So Business Insider had sold, Gilt had sold. And so I thought, you know, now I have an opportunity to do more things than I'd done in the past.
So maybe give a snapshot of like, what is AlleyCorp today in terms of like number of people,
so
and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so we have 28 people on the business side and divided mostly up in industry groups. So we have 7 people in healthcare, 2 people in social impact, 2 people in robotics, person in semiconductors and nanotechnology, person in developer tools, some generalists, and then, you know, some finance and accounting and legal people. And then we also have something that's unusual because I have an in-house outsourced engineering company that I own that I built up in the last 2 years that has 60 engineers. It'll be 100 by the end of the year. And so we have resources that we can apply to a new company and to move faster than I would have in the past. Also have a lot of search people. I have 14 full-time search people that either work for me or work for a firm that I co-founded that I own a big piece of, so that we can bring that to the table as well. And so those are resources that either we work for our own companies or we invest in a company and we'll bring that to them as well.
And by search people, you mean like headhunters to find the right people in the companies you're recruiting. And so the ambition is to build how many companies and what time frame, or is it just more ad hoc?
So the schedule we've been on, which is not precise, is roughly 8 companies a year. And then we invest in about 30 companies a year. So last year, for example, we invested about $110 million into those 2 buckets. About 40% of the money goes into the companies we start, either this year's crop or the follow-on rounds to last year. And about 60% into investments. But about 60% of our time goes into the companies we start. And the reason for that is, as you know, if a new idea comes in, it takes us, 2 weeks to look at it and decide yes or no. But to come up with a new idea often takes us 3 months.
Yeah.
And it could be that we have 2 separate people working on different ideas. Turns out one we don't want to do. The other one, we interview 50 people. We build up a business plan. It takes a long time before we pull the trigger. That can take months. So it's more time intensive. But of course, on the other hand, we're investing at a $1 million valuation. as opposed to in the first example, I'm investing at maybe a $10 million valuation.
Sure. And any companies you want to highlight, or the companies you've built in the last year or two, or any names that would ring a bell to any of the audience?
So some of them are still smallish, but there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal 10 days ago on Transcend, which is a company in the psychedelic space. It's an area I'm particularly interested in. I'm the leading funder of the Yale Center for Psychedelic Research. Big believer that for mental health, this is a very important issue. And so we did a deep dive 2 years ago and came up with an idea, and we're taking a compound through the FDA process. And we've raised $40 million for that company. And so at an 80 million pre, which 2 years in, if you compare that to the enterprise values of either Compass or Atai, it's actually a similar valuation. And so that means investors are very excited about the idea. It's doing very well, and still very risky, but interesting.
So it's a biotech company developing new psychedelic compounds for the treatment of depression.
So there's actually 300 different psychedelics. Okay. Most people here listening have heard of mushrooms or MDMA or LSD, but there are many, many different compounds, and some of them could have real use, even though they're not quite as enjoyable to take. So your friends are at a party, they're not taking them, but they may have enormous impact for one of the 6 or 7 conditions out there. So we're taking this through the process for depression and PTSD, and we're in phase 2 trials right now.
Okay, so this is not developing new compounds. This is testing existing compounds for PTSD and depression.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes...
And taking them through the FDA process.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, what's your ambition on a go-forward basis? Like, what's the dream, the goal, if there is an end state?
In some ways, I'm actually there in many ways. And the reason I say that is that I don't actually want to get that much bigger. We already start a lot of companies. We invest in a lot of companies. If it were twice as many companies, it just cuts my time in half. And, if it gets bigger and bigger, I will just be further pulled away from what I like doing, which is working with my partners and working with the CEOs and building those companies. And you just become more and more of an administrator and not a true operator executive. So I think I've scaled it to where I want to be there. I still, this is what I love to do. So there's nothing I get more excited about than hearing about a new idea that someone has. How do we build it? What are the challenges? Going through that, operating, building it. I think it's one of the greatest jobs for me that I could possibly do. I don't have any other ambitions, actually.
I think you're, for the first time, trying to raise external capital. Have you thought through the pros and cons of that? And I mean, obviously, it allows you to scale. Also, it allows you not to have to fund everything yourself, which is probably useful. But I'd love to hear how you think about this.
Yeah, I don't think about it, and I'm not planning on having it be any different than what we've done to date. And it's going to be the same strategy and roughly the same size. But it's more driven by the fact that I can't keep investing $100 million in cash every year, given that I'm being conservative, but I don't think there's going to be any liquidity in our industry for the next 2 years. So that's just a different assumption. If you'd asked me 18 months ago, I would have said, yeah, every year one of my companies will go public, they'll get sold, money will be coming back. But we're not seeing that right now, and you're probably in the same position.
Yeah, no, I suspect there will be very, very few exits, and no secondaries, no IPOs, very little M&A, other than like companies dying or being bought for scraps. So, totally agree with that perspective.
So, we're telling potential investors that we're going to just keep doing what we're doing, same thing, no change. This is what we do. We've been, it's been working very well. Returns have been very good. So we're going to keep doing this and keep having fun. There's some people who try and build a business that just manage as much money as possible because they get fees. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're doing. I want to keep doing what I like doing. I'm not a good late stage investor. I don't have those instincts. Things seem expensive. It's more about, a financial model. You need to have like bankers on your team that are doing that. We don't have that. We have all people who build companies and build products.
So you've been called the Godfather of the New York tech ecosystem. So how has New York evolved, and are we there yet? And if not, what's next for New York?
Yeah, so I think things are going extraordinarily well for New York. They couldn't be going better. And so, look, tech's growing everywhere, but on a relative basis, we can't forget that New York was at zero, 25 years ago. And today, in some sectors like crypto, is ahead of San Francisco. In others, we're still the number 2 city, but we're the clear number 2 city. People listening to this forget that in 1996, the number one question we had at DoubleClick was, why are you in New York and not in Boston? Because Boston was perceived as being the tech capital of the East Coast. And it really dated back to the 80s and 90s where they had, DEC and Wang and some big computer companies. And that's almost hard to imagine today. New York has obliterated Boston from a startup point of view, with the exception of healthcare. Still has very strong healthcare and robotics practice in Boston. And the reason is, I always tell people, if you want to know what city is going to be the best tech city in your country, just go to the top 10 universities, tell me where those people want to go move. That's going to be your city. Because our industry is driven, for better or worse, by people from the top 10, 20. It's the smartest people. Not all of them come from the top universities, but that's where the class from Yale and Princeton and Harvard and other places are going. They want to come to New York because there are great clubs, there's great ballet, anything you're into, there's great food, whatever it is, and you are world class, and you are the type of person who would rather have a smaller apartment but be on the cutting edge of whatever is happening in the world. That's the person who's going to start a new incredible company.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, and do you only build in New York? Do you mostly invest in New York? Do you only invest in New York?
Yeah, so we almost only build in New York. And the reason is, it's just hard for me to put a management team together in LA or San Francisco. Just don't have the relationships. And we have so many relationships here. And we're building the company. It's not just happening on its own. We got to find the CEO, we got to find everything. So, we have 1 or 2 in Washington that are close by, but generally it's really mostly New York. When we invest, it depends on our vertical. So, for example, our robotics vertical, that's the only person who's not located in New York. He's in Boston. Boston and San Francisco are the 2 leading centers. So he really invests on a national and sometimes international basis because it's industry focused. But our portfolio overall is probably 60 to 70% here. We do some investing in Latin America and some in Europe. And I do nothing in Africa, Asia, not because they're not good places, but I have one golden rule: is I don't invest, if I'm going to be involved with a company, in a place that I don't want to go to all the time. And those are great places to go, but I have enough jet lag in my life between Europe and the United States. I'm not adding on Asia and Africa and Australia all the time.
Sophie is asking on Twitch, Kevin, you said that it can take around 3 months to create the idea for a company and around 2 weeks to evaluate. When you evaluate an idea you're excited about, what goes through your mind? What's the criteria?
Yeah, and I don't think this is different than other people. When we're looking at a very early stage idea, there's really just 2 things. There's the sort of product idea. So what's the market? Do we think there's a need for it? Do they have a vision for a product that is differentiated? And second is the team. And if it's not a great team, you just can't go there. And the team is almost more important. There have been times when we've thought, idea is pretty good, but the person is the perfect person. And 6 months from now, they may even, and we've seen this many times, alter their idea a little bit as they get into the market. But as long as they understand the market and know it, they're going to come up with something really great.
Cool, thank you.
I'll give you an example right now. We're looking at the assisted fertility market. So I'm highly confident because women are having children later. Gay men want to have children. Sperm counts are coming down. More and more people, I will bet anything on this over the next 10 years, are going to need help getting pregnant. The second thing I look at in a market there is everyone incredibly happy with the process? And the answer is no. It's very expensive. It's opaque. It's not easy. Percentage of people in Germany who have assisted fertility is higher than the US. So there's room to grow. So that's the sort of thought process. It happens to be for a company we're starting, but that's how we look at a new market and a new opportunity as well.
How did you pick the verticals you're going after? Robotics, healthcare, these are categories where you, your background doesn't scream, oh, I have expertise here. Is it just curiosity because these are fun, interesting things, or?
Yeah, it's partly curiosity, but also for most of them, because we start so early, we have to have a 10-year time frame. So when we're at an offsite, we put up today 2033. Yeah. And so you made a point of view like I think this or I think this. I would ask you, so Fabrice, I know it's happening right now, like COVID, okay, it's a thing. Is it a thing in 2033? Because if it's not, I don't want to build a company. I don't go in and out of things quickly.
Yep.
Big companies get built, and you really got to count on a decade. I wish it were faster, but it's not. So, robotics and automation is a good example of something where, labor costs are going up, tech costs are coming down. I'll bet on that all day long for the next decade. Healthcare is slightly different. It's going to continue to grow, but not at an extraordinary rate. But we happen to be in a place where healthcare is so expensive and so bad on so many dimensions, and I'm talking about the United States, that creates opportunities. E-commerce, which is a space that you and I know pretty well, unfortunately for consumer e-commerce, it's pretty mature. Every single thing I know of can be delivered to your house in probably 24 hours, and you can choose among 10,000 possibilities. So guess what? I don't have any better ideas. I don't know how to make it better. So I do very little there. Things like developer tools continue to evolve. That changes all the time. Same as security. I just don't have the people in-house. Semiconductors, nanotechnology, fascinating space, for a bunch of reasons, partly government driven, but partly technology driven. That is the underpinning of everything we do, whether people realize it or not. Your car is becoming a big semiconductor, where even 10 years ago it wasn't. You knew your computer was. So these are big fundamental trends. And I spend, like I think you do, Fabrice, a lot of time thinking, reading, meeting with people, trying to understand where the world's going. And sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I don't get it right. But it's interesting.
This makes me think there's a company I absolutely must introduce you to in the robotic space. It's called Figure.ai. They do humanoid robots who basically go in the warehouses and they can do the picking and the packing and pick up the boxes and bring them to the whatever Amazon delivery trucks. And
huge opportunity.
Yeah,
huge opportunity.
The founders at Epic, they've hired some of the very best people from Boston Dynamics, et cetera, and they're absolutely amazing. So I'll do this post this. So what are the biggest trends you're most excited about in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, so some of the ones are ones we've talked about there. Certainly, the big verticals I talked about that we're in. The verticals that I'm not in, but I think are very interesting, I just don't have the expertise and I can't do everything, are things like ag tech. So I think that on the food side, on lab-grown meat, on everything in terms of our food system, we're going to need you to do it better, cheaper, more distributed. So billions of dollars of value is going to be created there. I'm not super, bullish these days or excited about crypto blockchain. So we're spending relatively little space there. Another space that has had a bunch of interesting ideas is in the prop tech space. I have a couple investments there, but I'm not deeply focused on it. But, in many ways, I think that bringing technology to industries that haven't had it, like some have all the technology they need and there's nothing more to be done. But in some areas, I'll tell you an area that we're excited about, the maritime industry. Mm-hmm. So, shipping is going to grow steadily for the next 10 years because of international commerce, but it's under-teched. So when you're looking at marketplaces for labor, for procurement, things like that, those are areas that we're excited about. We're spending time right now in the organoid space. So organoids are really when you can create in a petri dish, essentially, the beginnings of an organ. So let's say an esophagus. And many different applications. One is not that eventually maybe we'll create an esophagus that we can put in you, but that's actually not our focus. Our focus is, can we test a drug on your esophagus that's not in your body? When you think about it, that's revolutionary, because right now the choices are, we kill 1,000 dogs or rats to do that, which obviously no one's excited about, although it happens every day. And then eventually we start putting it in your body. And incredibly expensive. If you said, why do certain drugs take $500 million to get approved? It's because we don't have this. So we're trying to decide right now and working with some of the best people in the world, is this the right time to commercialize this? But super interesting area.
And that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is one of these things where it absolutely is going to happen. There's almost zero risk of that. The question is it now or is it 5 years from now? Are we a little too early? Work and organize has been happening for a decade. And if I had started this 10 years ago, I would have been too early. It would have been solar energy in 1995. Good idea, but the math didn't work. And so that's what's interesting. And by the way, 4 months ago, I didn't know anything about organoids. But now working with the team, we're learning more about it.
You know what's interesting is like you and I live in the future in a way, right? There's a saying, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? The graphic interface was Park Xerox in 67 and the mouse. It became mass market in 84. And I think I'm going to write a blog post on this. It's like in 2012, when I looked at investing in Uber, I was fretting that like self-driving cars is going to break their business model. And we're in 2023, and I was like, this is obviously happening, in the next few years, and things move slower than we expect. So timing and being too early probably kills more businesses than many, many other ideas. In fact, most of the ideas we saw in the late 90s actually turned out they were correct and worked. So they just didn't work then. They work today.
Well, a good example of that is, people are talking about AI. And the truth is that if you look at the AI algorithms, almost every single one was created in the 70s and 80s. What has changed is not that they have this new algorithm necessarily. It's that the computing power and databases and things like that allow you to analyze all this data in a way that's more efficient and cost effective. That's what's changed. But often it takes 30 years for something to go from the lab in some university to really be out there when everyone's using it.
So switching gears outside of the professional sphere and into the personal sphere, and obviously in our cases, I think we weave our lives in a way where our professional and personal interests like blend into another. Like obviously you're the one who took me to Antarctica. You do a lot of these types of trips as well. Was that like, were you into these things before? Like how do you like square that circle in terms of what your personal interests are and how they blend in your professional life?
Yeah, I think so. I've always been someone who's been athletic. I was played a lot of sports growing up, a lot of team sports. Then about 25 years ago, when I was running DoubleClick, I found I couldn't make team sports schedule-wise very easily. I also had 3 kids, so I switched over to triathlons. Then evolved that a little bit more into more yoga, personal training, less racing. And in the last 10 years, I've been just doing a little bit more outdoors stuff. And I realized that I really enjoy that. Obviously, our Antarctic trip was the most extreme version of that. You and I are never going to do something more extreme than that. But no, next week I'm going skinning in Norway in the Arctic Circle with my wife and 4 other couples. And so that's where you walk up the mountain on your skis for 4 hours or 5 hours, and then you ski down completely untouched. There are no lifts. It's more like a great hike plus an amazing ski at the end. So things like that I love. I do a biking trip with 8 guys every year. Super fun, relatively demanding, but really fun. I'm looking forward to doing more and more, not extreme hikes, but, rigorous hikes. And I just think it adds so much, and especially when you can do it with fun. I mean, we had amazing conversations on our Antarctic trip, got to know some new people. In addition, pushed ourselves physically, pushed ourselves psychologically. That's just a great week or two.
Totally agreed. And frankly, we are so busy, right? Like, and I think that our intellectual curiosity pushes us to probably do more than we should. Like, I think you and I were having this conversation. We're investors in too many funds. We're investors in too many companies. Yep. We're meeting too many people because it's fun and interesting. The problem is like, and so, but if you're doing, you're not thinking. And so actually taking time off to think, even though we're doing it for fun, quote unquote, I actually think is extraordinarily insightful and leads to, frankly, groundbreaking professional insights. Maybe for the audience, do you want to talk about a little bit of how the Antarctica trip happened and maybe any lessons from it, if any?
Yeah, so it happened because there's a doctor in London who I knew pretty well, Jack Kreindler, who has worked with a lot of extreme athletes, people who climb Mount Everest. So he became interested in how breakthrough science occurs when you push humans, because you learn a lot about what works and what doesn't work. And so then he also ran into the British military, who were interested in this issue as well. And so he decided to put a trip together that would be a scientific expedition to the South Pole. And so we were wearing a special watch or a ring, glucose monitors. They took our urine before, weight, fat percentage. Every day we were interviewed. And so there'll be a number of academic papers written about this. And so then we had to get a group of people together who wanted to do this, which is not easy. It's quite an expensive trip. It's 2.5 weeks. Antarctica is always expensive because everything has to be flown there from 5 hours away. So finding people, and by the way, Fabrice was the first person I called, who were physically in good shape, were willing to suffer a little bit, because if you want to be at the Four Seasons, you're in the wrong place, and are relatively well off because it's quite expensive. Half the people I called who were well off and pretty good shape were like, why would I sleep in a tent at 25 degrees below zero for 8 days? They can go to St. Bart's. Totally get that. But there was a self-selected group of people, like Fabrice and me and some others, that loved it, and it was a trip of a lifetime. One other special thing for me is that my son was there. One of my 3 kids came with me, who's 25. He had a great time. Obviously, an amazing bonding experience for the two of us.
Yeah, I think you told me it's probably the hardest thing, or one of the hardest things you've done in your life, which probably also includes like building startups. And so, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, anything. The things we had to deal with, like we had to poop in a garbage bag every day and bring it with you. So I don't know how many people are listening do that all the time, but I generally don't. I use a thing called a toilet in my house, which, works really well.
Any takeaways from the trip?
More that I didn't have any breakthroughs personally. I just really enjoyed being with myself for hours, slowing everything down in some ways. This is a geeky little biohacking thing, but one of the things we tracked in our Oura Rings is your HRV. And my HRV after 4 or 5 days was higher than I have ever gotten it since. So that says something physically, and it could be the combination that I wasn't doing email, that visually was less, spectacular going on. And so maybe it was sort of meditative in some way. And I don't meditate that much, but this put me in a state that I have not achieved since then. And so I think you're really at peace. I had great relationships. I felt good about the world. I felt good about life. Felt good about my body doing it. So all of those things have to be positive.
Are you tempted to do a Vipassana retreat, like 10-day silent meditation as a result of this, or not really?
So I'm not. My wife does 2 or 3 a year of a week-long silent meditation retreat, and she absolutely loves it. So many people get a lot of benefit out of it. I think I may start by doing like a day or so or two and see how I enjoy that.
Yeah, I think I'm on your camp, but after you do that, let me know how it goes, and I might replicate it as well. We have Yann Lechelle from Facebook asking, what's your take on the EU or even the French tech ecosystems versus New York and San Francisco or other regions? Second tier or in the race? Capital, talent, exit market, etc.
Yeah, so in general, startups are working everywhere. So, Fabrice and I are somewhat close to the French ecosystem, and it's so much better than it was 10 years ago, so much better than it was 20 years ago. Is it the United States? No. But then if we talked about each country in Europe, we would have a different story. But if you're talking about France, France has an unusual amount of AI talent and math talent, much more so than Germany. Germany has a lot of electrical engineering talent. They just encourage that, but they're very talented people and not as expensive. So a number of really good startups in France. All of Europe has a disadvantage because if you're doing anything that is linked to your border, it's just harder to go do it in Germany and then in Italy and then in Spain, and the language changes and there's often regulations. It's not really one market always. So it's harder for them to build, big companies as big as a Facebook. But overall, it's doing great. And the single thing that both Fabrice and I know, Fabrice was an outlier 20 years ago wanting to do a startup. And, the cool kids were going to work for the government at the time, or maybe working for a bank. But now the cool kids, the Fabrice of today, he actually will leave a top university and go do a startup. And so that's a great thing for France. So I feel very good about it. They've changed the tax policy. It's better. Look, there's still in France a number of annoying administrative things that make it harder. So still the U.S. market is the best market in the world to do a startup, but Europe is doing fine.
It's really worth mentioning that Kevin is a proper Francophile. He married an amazing French woman. He spends maybe 5 months a year in France and speaks French perfectly.
Yeah, I grew up in Geneva for 5 years, which influenced my entire life. So I do spend a lot of time in Europe. I went to business school in France, So I essentially live between New York and Europe.
Yeah, no, I had the privilege of visiting him in Provence. He also has a place in Val d'Isère, and definitely loves Europe, and especially France.
Yep.
If I take a step back and I think through the one thing that both of us have probably changed our mind the most on in the last decade, right? Like we were kind of like nerdy intellectual guys into foreign policy and politics and startups, etc. It's probably psychedelics, right? Like I think both you and I, 10 years ago, if anyone had thought like we'd changed our mind on that, they'd be like, what are you smoking? There's no way.
Yeah.
Our comparative advantage in life is our intellect, and we wouldn't do anything that puts that at risk in any way, shape, or form. And yet, I think both you and I have had a 180-degree perspective of that. So I'd love to hear, what has led to that change in perspective, and what your perspective was then, what it is today, and any insights from that.
Yeah, no, 10 years ago, I really thought of just all drugs being a problem and just fundamentally bad. And I think the government tried to teach us that for a long time. I was very influenced, as many people were, by the Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind, which I recommend for everyone. One of the New York Times top 10 books, I think, of 2017. And that changed the psychedelic industry, because you realize that actually I was wrong, that there's certainly for mental health, that it's going to be a breakthrough thing, that, state by state, nationally, there are multiple compounds that will be legal, and it will heal tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people for PTSD, for depression, for anorexia, for OCD, for anxiety, and for addiction. People should not use it at all if they're bipolar, if they have psychotic episodes. So you have to be careful. But if you look at the Economist chart of drugs, of which ones are safest, what's ironic is that alcohol is the most dangerous, above heroin, and the safest ones are all the psychedelics. And so they're not most of the psychedelics, like MDMA and psilocybin and LSD, are not addictive, and you cannot overdose. And then on a recreational basis, it can be incredibly enjoyable. And so I think there's experiences that, when done intelligently, can broaden your mind, expand your mind, create great friendships, create great experiences, put you in a situation where you're enjoying art in a way, or music in a way that is really beneficial. So some of my best experiences in the last 3 years have involved, moderate use of psychedelics. And so I felt very good about that.
So that transition started happening for you in 2017 with the Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind.
Yeah.
And when was the first time you went to Burning Man? And when was the first time you did psychedelics at Burning Man?
Yeah, 2018. Okay. So that was the first time in there. And, I was very, very, I came into this nervous and cautious. So extremely small doses, make sure I understood it, really, as one should. You have to know what you're doing and do it sensibly and do it with people who know how to do it. But the reality is today, I'm amazed at how many people have tried it, even though in many environments it's not legal. There are many environments you can go to in Costa Rica, in Jamaica, in Amsterdam, where things can be legal. It will be legal to be prescribed in Oregon starting this year, Colorado starting a year from now, Connecticut, New York State, other states are moving forward. 6 months, Australia, it'll be legal to prescribe MDMA and psilocybin. The people are realizing that we were all wrong. Governments were wrong. And so this should be done. It should be regulated. It should be monitored. But it can be very beneficial.
And I guess it's your personal interest that probably led to Transcend.
Yes. No, I was, and that's how some of these companies come. I was quite knowledgeable about it. I was spending time at conferences at Yale, talking to people, reading research papers. And then, so we spent 2.5 months doing a deep dive, interviewing 50 people in the industry, trying to see where it was going. It's hard to start a business when it's completely illegal everywhere, which it was 3 years ago. But we came up with an idea that we think makes sense. I have 2 other small investments in other companies, one linked to the ketamine space and one linked to a real estate play in Costa Rica that is doing a clinic called Holos, where people can do a high-end retreat.
What's your perspective on Burning Man? Like, what do you think about Burning Man?
So I am just an enormous fan of Burning Man. I think it's the best week of the year. It self-selects for people who decide they're going to suffer a little bit. There's going to be dust storms. It's not easy to get to. you're going to be in an RV or a tent, but you're going to be with people who decide that they care about extraordinary creativity. I mean, anyone who hasn't been there, if you go on and just look at the outfits, the art cars, the art objects, it's in an average day, I see 5 things that I've never seen before, that I've never imagined before. And all of this is done with not anyone making any money. So you'll see a car that a bunch of people put together that costs $300,000, that's there playing music, has the best DJs in the world, and it's only so that everyone else can enjoy it. You know, you can't buy anything there. It's just an amazing thing. I don't know how they started and got it to where it is today, but it's something that I would never miss today. And for the right people, you should go.
Yeah, I convinced my mom to go this year, and so I'm currently working on getting her there in a safe way and finding an art car that I can drive her around in, because obviously she can be biking. So it'd be amazing.
One of my regrets in life, I wish I could have taken my mother 10 years ago. She passed away 4 years ago, but I would have taken her if I could. And now each one of my children, when they get to be like 24 or 25, if they want to go, I bring them to Burning Man. And so far I've brought 2 of them there. And I think my third one's going to want to go as well.
Yeah, I intend to do the same. So Sophie, in 9 years, you're going. She's watching us right now. I can see that. Ali is asking, aside from psilocybin, have you experienced with ayahuasca? Any thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I actually surprisingly have not. I will be doing it for the first time this year. I have many friends who had great experiences. During COVID, I was going to be doing it, and it's not a very COVID-friendly thing at the time because you're often in a circle all singing together with a lot of people. So I didn't think it was a good idea, but yeah, I will report back at the end of the year because I'm already signed up to do it.
So Ali, I've done it, and I did it actually in Brooklyn, and it was beautiful. My grandmother came to visit me, convinced me that I should that I should actually have kids, and made an extraordinarily amazing argument for why. And in fact, her name is Françoise, which is an homage to her that my son is called Francois. I got visited by these white German shepherds. I didn't even know they existed. This is going to be my next dog. So it was very meaningful for me, and I highly recommend it. But you should do the work ahead of time, meaning I didn't eat meat for 10 days. I did a full 2-day fast before. I dressed in white, no alcohol, no sex, no caffeine. I mean, you do the work, and you go there prepared and in a pure state and ready. And I really loved it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Arnaud Collery says, interesting. I recommend the book Stealing Fire. I don't know if you've ever read it, on performance and how you use flow states for performance.
I've not read that.
Yeah, I've read the book, and it's very insightful, but at the same time, I don't think that's the reason. We don't do psychedelics or reach flow states for performance. We do them because they're enjoyable in their own right. So it's a very, in tantric terms, I'd say masculine perspective from that book. That said, makes good arguments to why people that might otherwise be skeptical, it might be the gateway for them to start getting in there.
Yeah.
Let's see.
But I know people who don't make a major business decision before doing a psychedelic experience because they just get clarity, obviously not from the psychedelics. It's just unlocking things in your own brain and seeing clarity. That visit from your grandmother obviously was really you talking to yourself, but somehow delivered in a way that always makes sense. The thing I find so extraordinary is that I never hear someone say, oh, I did, this major psychedelic experience and I had this crazy dumb advice to, do something I never thought about doing. This has never happened.
I agree. Here's what's interesting. It's like, if you're hesitating between paths, you can imagine both paths. In the case of ayahuasca, the path that's wrong, you just feel nauseous. The path that's right, you feel great. I mean, it's really, really interesting. And I have no idea how it works, but I guess it's your subconscious telling you this is the correct path for you.
Yeah.
And, I actually, what you just said about, like, if you're facing a major life decision, go do one of these deep journeys. It could be whatever, a 5+ gram psilocybin journey. It could be ayahuasca. It could be other things. It will tell you what the correct answer is.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's interesting you referred to this is that we know, I feel like we know definitively that it works. There's been 295 academic studies, double blind. So the data is pretty clear. We know much less why it works. So yes, we'll say to you it's neuroplasticity, connects things in your brain. But if you want to level further, like why did your grandmother show up? Why did she give good advice? We don't really understand that. And because we don't know everything about the brain yet. 10 years from now, we will. And I think where we'll be 10 years from now is, let's say you came in and you have anorexia, or we'll look at you and say, you know what? We're going to give you compound 3 and compound 7 with just a touch of 19. In the same way that if I was going to make a drink for you, I would know, if I'm a good bartender, what we should put together there. But we will know the right thing for your brain and what you need at that point. And I would get something different than you would.
I'm not sure it'll be that quick because our understanding of the brain is so primitive. But is there a future where this is coming? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sophie said.
To our earlier point, it could be like driverless cars. It's always 5 years away, and it really is 20 years away.
Sophie says, clearly we should have brought her to Antarctica. I totally agree. There's this pesky thing called high school that got in the way, but...
Yeah.
Anything else we didn't discuss or cover that we should have done or should discuss?
No, I feel good about, we haven't touched on politics or geopolitics that much. In general, the startup community and financing in the United States is extraordinary, and in most places the world is just getting better and better. So, I think people tend to underestimate how impactful in making the world a better place early stage financing and the role that it plays. If you don't have capital to start this idea that eventually will be purchased by a large company and monetized, your world doesn't move forward. And you can go to places where that doesn't happen, and that is the core problem. And so when I look at the world now, most of the things that have moved the world forward started, whether you like driverless cars or a cure for cancer or anything, or the entire internet, someone had to fund that and take a chance the fact that 80% of the things are going to fail. And that's just remarkable that we're in this place and you and I benefit from it, and the world benefits from it.
It's interesting. But most people don't realize, the people who democratize the tech that gets invented are actually the ones who are helping this and pushing this deflationary power that changes people's life for the better. I mean, the life of 200 years ago in 1823, when life expectancy is 29 and everyone's working 80 hours a week and everyone's a farmer, going hungry multiple times a year, it's been changed because people investors backed these new ideas over time, and then entrepreneurs scaled them to touch the lives of billions. So it's pretty extraordinary.
But the other thing I think that gets under-recognized is the role that the top universities play in developing the core technology that those entrepreneurs eventually use. Yeah. And so, and we see the difference now. Frankly, there's no breakthrough technology, and this may be an overstatement, coming out of Germany. Why? Because they just don't have those universities with hundreds of professors who are working on all kinds of studies. By the way, 70% of them are silly and never amount to anything. But some of them will change the world someday. And the U.S. has that. And everyone can make fun of Princeton and Harvard having $25 billion endowments. But you know what a lot of that endowment goes to? Breakthrough science that is going to mean that your grandmother is going to live 10 years longer because of what is being discovered.
Yeah, I mean, you need both, right? You need the fundamental invention, but then you need the founders and the entrepreneurs and whatever, the capitalist funding ecosystem to grow it. And if you have that symbiosis, it's pretty beautiful.
And China has done a very good job of developing core research in the last decade. Europe is sort of falling behind a little bit outside of some pockets in UK and a little bit in France. But, frankly, there's very little coming out of Italy or Spain. And these are huge developed countries, but they just don't have that sort of excess spending. And Latin America has very little. And so all the hardcore science has to be really come out of only a couple countries.
Are you worried by either the fallout of SVB and what it means for the tech ecosystem writ large and its failure, and maybe the latter is more concerning, the fact that there seems to be a growing anti-tech sentiment in the U.S., both in the political system and sphere writ large, and it's not just directed at large companies. It seems to be tech, VCs, et cetera. I mean, especially after SVB, I'm seeing hatred and vitriol against VCs on Twitter, which I find surprising. And frankly, by the masses writ large that seem to be increasingly anti-tech.
So on the first point, I think the impact of SVB will just be a downer for the next year or two. It's reminded people that there's risk to people. VCs are more and more nervous. Less money will go out the door. So it's just going to be a tougher time. Valuations will come down. The truth is they were way too high last year. So I think 50% of that is normal. Will we overshoot the mark a little bit? Yes. But still, even today, things are getting funded. I think they'll continue to get funded. There's plenty of money available out there. It'll just be deployed slower than we would like. We'll start to see, like, if you asked me a year and a half ago, did I see any companies failing, even my own, some of which were not that great, they still kept getting funded. That's not good. We're going to go back to a good place. The best companies will get funded. I feel okay about that. Anti-tech backlash, I mean, look, there is some of it. Tech is just so important. It's just so much bigger. I mean, I was looking at the market cap of, Credit Suisse, which you and I 20 years ago used to think of it as this colossal bank. Now it's tiny compared to MongoDB and Datadog and companies that no one's ever heard of. Tech is dominating the world. There's always going to be some backlash with that. I still haven't seen to date terrible legislation against tech that's caused a problem. There are rumors about it. So far, I think we're okay. And, look, your average person still realizes that tech is helping them. They like their TV. They like their Netflix. They like everything they're looking online. They like the fact that their grandmother has some amazing technology that's keeping her alive. So I still think we're okay, but I'm nervous about it. I'm more fundamentally worried about, the partisanship. I think some of the things at the far right, I'm on the left, on the far right are pushing for, I think are insane and I think are destructive. So I think the anti-science perspective, which tech is a small part of, but the fact that we're debating where the climate change is happening, to me, is unthinkable and and crazy. The fact that people want to argue that every journalist and media and smart person and scientist and university are somehow biased and doing the wrong thing is really destructive, and that's been encouraged. I was just reading about some of the anti-vaccine stuff that started in 2005. Is just wrong. I mean, the data is there. Vaccines work. And so that is very harmful.
I'm worried about extremes on both sides, honestly, and both of which seem anti-tech. Serge on YouTube is asking whether or not you've looked at like brain machine interfaces and things like Neuralink. Yeah, we haven't yet. I don't think that's a sub area that we have enough expertise on, but I'm fascinated by. I think it'd be very interesting. So it's like one of those many other areas that I would like to know more about and don't know enough about. One of the LinkedIn users is asking, they feel perhaps there's a very strong anti-immigrant sentiment in the U.S. Like they want to come to the U.S., they want to raise money in the U.S., they just can't get visas. I don't know if you have a perspective on that. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's here's a country that we all know completely built on immigrants. All of us are immigrants. Most of us, we're just debating when. And so to think that this country right now, mostly, I think, led and encouraged in the Trump administration, but it hasn't gotten that much better under Biden. We should be letting people in. I have a big engineering office in Canada, and the only reason is because they allow immigrants in. If you go into an office in Canada, it's not very Canadian. It's people from China and Botswana and France because they can get visas. And so I wake up and I can't imagine that a country is saying, we're going to not make it easy for unbelievably smart, well-educated people to come to our country. And yet here we are, right? Like, do you see that changing? So, look, I assume it will at some point. We're at 3 points. I would have told you 10 years ago, when we get to 3.6% unemployment, people are going to relax and realize that we're far more labor shortages. I mean, how many people here have gone into a restaurant and they're like, I'm sorry, we don't have enough waiters today, so we can't serve you. And that's happening all the time. So obviously we need this. And it's so frustrating. I tell every senator I meet, I use as an example a hypothetical guy named Muhammad who lives in Pakistan. And I'm going to hire him because he's brilliant. You can determine, because he wants to move to New York, and I'll pay him $200,000. But if you don't let me do that, I'll hire him in Pakistan. All the tax dollars will go there. By the way, in 4 years, he's so brilliant, he's going to start a company across the street. Do you want that to be in Islamabad
or in New York City.
I've made this argument many times, and it's mostly fallen on deaf ears, but yeah.
Yeah. So it's one of the many very frustrating issues. It seems so clear.
Yeah.
Canada's eating our lunch, and there are tens of billions of dollars of value and tax dollars that are going to go to Canada that aren't going to go to us, when these are people who actually wanted to come here first.
Sophie's asking, what is the most fundamental way AlleyCorp changed the way it works with companies from launch to now? What is your take on investors treading the line of involvement in terms of how helpful they should and can be post-investment?
Yeah, so, the investors and the board, we shouldn't forget, are in charge of picking the CEO. And so that's one of the most fundamental decisions. You don't change very lightly. We do it very, very rarely, but occasionally it's the right thing to do. You have a fiduciary responsibility to everyone, not just your own investment. And when I'm on a board of a company, I think that I represent every employee who has options in that company, who is a shareholder. And so I need to make right decisions for that person as well. And so we try and help out as much as we can, give advice. The CEO has to run the company. If we start running the company, then a good CEO will resign and go somewhere else. So we don't want to do that, and we don't have the time to do that. So we try and strike the right line and do that and help them, but let them run the company.
Makes sense. Do you think there's ever a time in your life where you might be CEO again? I guess you're a CEO of AlleyCorp. That's a startup.
Yeah, and I also have, as I was saying, actually multiple businesses. So we already have 100 employees that I really do manage, and that'll grow over time. So I don't think now, given that responsibility, I can easily step in to run another company. And I actually think I'd be worse now. I'm not. I wouldn't want to focus on the details as much. I'm not as sort of cutthroat as I was 20 years ago. So I think I'd be worse today. I think I'm a better chairman today than I.
By the way, you maybe should do the same thing at AlleyCorp. You shouldn't be managing 100 people. Like you're still a better chairman. Right? I feel the same way.
And I have someone who really manages almost all the finance and operations. I'm Jay Haas, who came over, who plays a big role there. So we do structure it so that I can spend most of my time on the things where I'm most value added. And I enjoy the book.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, that's why I have partners and I have Jose and at FJ Labs. Like, if I read any legal contracts, after 3 words, I'm like, I fell asleep already, or I need to deal with finances and budgets and most of these things. Yeah,
and another thing that you and I know share is, which makes us the wrong person for certain tasks, is that my base assumption is that it's going to work out fine. And so
I agree.
Any lawyer would be like, no, our entire job is to think about all the things that are going to go wrong, which I don't think about at all.
Yeah. I mean, going from 1 to 0 is irrelevant. I care about the 1 to 1,000 as do you.
Yeah. So, but I do need someone to think about those things because, you need to have protections, you need to have insurance, there's things you need to have in place. But other people are better at that than I am.
For sure, for both of us. Anything we didn't cover that we should have covered?
No, I think we've covered a lot of things here, but you and I can talk for hours. And I just want to say also that I've admired you for a long time and watched what you've done and learned from you, both professionally and personally. And so it's there are very few people in the world, in the city of New York, who I think I overlap with in so many different ways. And so it's just great to be on the show, and it's great to be a friend.
Thank you. I feel exactly the same way. We can create our mutual admiration society. And thank you for the audience for all your questions. And it's been super fun and entertaining. And I'll see you in the next show. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.